What happens when a veteran cop with a history of bias unknowingly pulls over the state's most powerful man? This encounter is about to change everything for him, for the community, and for the future of justice. It was a quiet afternoon on the long stretch of Route 29, just outside Charlottesville, Virginia. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden hues across the asphalt. Officer Ted Marshall, a 20-year veteran of the police force, sat in his patrol car, parked on the shoulder, scanning the road for any vehicles that caught his attention. Marshall was known in the area for his no-nonsense attitude, and though never officially acknowledged his frequent targeting of black drivers, he spotted a sleek black SUV approaching in the distance, moving just a hair over the speed limit. Marshall's lips curled into a slight smirk as he reached for the siren. "Gotcha," he muttered under his breath. The SUV slowed obediently over to the side of the road. The driver rolled down his window as Marshall approached. He was a young black man, dressed sharply in a tailed suit, with an air of confidence that was impossible to miss. His calm expression didn't falter as Marshall leaned in. "License and registration," Marshall barked, his tone sharp. His posture imposing, the young man handed over his documents without hesitation. Offering a polite nod, Marshall scrutinized the license. Though it was clear the documents were in order, still he wasn't satisfied. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Marshall asked, his voice tinged with a hint of condescension. "I assume you tell me," the man replied evenly, his tone respectful but firm. Marshall frowned, clearly irked by the lack of nervousness. "You were speeding," he declared, though the accusation felt thin, even to him. "Step out of the vehicle, please." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he complied, stepping out with measured grace. He stood tall, meeting Marshall's gaze without fear or defiance. "What brings you to this area?" Marshall pressed, circling the vehicle as though looking for a reason to escalate the situation. "Work," the man replied, simply folding his hands in front of him. Marshall's suspicion only deepened, fueled not by anything tangible, but by his own biases. The officer leaned in, trying to rattle the man. "You seem awfully calm for someone who just got pulled over. Got something to hide?" The young man smiled faintly, but his eyes held steady. "No, officer, do you?" Marshall's face hardened, the words striking a nerve. He straightened up, looming over the man, trying to assert control. But for the first time in a long time, Marshall felt a flicker of unease, not because of what the man had done, but because of how unshakable he seemed. What started as an ordinary traffic stop was about to take a turn no one could have predicted, one that would leave Marshall questioning everything he thought he knew about power, respect. And just as Marshall's irritation grew as he walked around the SUV, peering through the windows with exaggerated scrutiny, he tapped the back of the car with his flashlight. Though it was still daylight, it was a subtle, almost habitual move, a way to leave a trace of his presence. "Open the trunk." Marshall ordered. The man hesitated for a brief moment, just enough to make the officer's suspicions flare. "Is there a problem with my documents?" the man asked. His voice still calm, though now tinged with a hint of curiosity. "You seem awfully concerned with my questions, Marcia." LL snapped back. "Just open the trunk." The man sighed softly, but complied, walking to the back of the car and opening it with a press of a button inside. There was nothing but a neatly packed leather briefcase and a small duffel bag. Marshall rummaged through the contents of the bag, with little care, unfolding neatly pressed shirts and rifling through personal items. "Traveling for work? Huh. What kind of work needs a wardrobe like this?" The man leaned against the car, arms crossed but relaxed. "The kind where appearances matter. Should I be concerned about the way you're handling my things?" Marshall straightened, holding up a perfectly innocent shaving kit as though it were contraband. He was digging for something, anything. But the man remained unfazed. That composure only fueled Marshall's frustration. "You're awfully bold for someone pulled over on my highway." Marshall sneered. "Your highway?" The man tilted his head, his tone carrying a subtle challenge. "I didn't realize Route 29 was privately owned." Marshall stepped closer, now toe-to-toe with the man, hoping to intimidate him. "You've got a smart mouth on you that might not work out so well for you." The man held his ground. "Officer," he said, his voice suddenly lower, more serious. "Are you sure you want to keep going down this path?" Marshall scoffed. "Is that a threat?" "No," the man replied, shaking his head slightly. It's a question before Marshall could respond. A car slowed as it passed the occupants, clearly observing the scene. A pair of children in the back seat pressed their faces to the glass, their eyes wide with curiosity. Marshall shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the optics. "You can stop with the theatrics," the man said, his voice calm, but firm. "I'm in. Oh, too, you think I am, and you're about to find that out." Marshall's mouth opened, ready to fire back, but the words stuck. Something in the man's tone gave him pause, though his pride wouldn't let him admit it. He turned abruptly and began typing the man's information into his patrol car's computer. The results popped up instantly, and Marshall froze. The man wasn't just a citizen passing through. His name was Elijah Porter. The newly elected governor of Virginia. Marshall blinked at the screen, his pulse quickening. He stared at the man through the windshield, trying to process what this meant. Elijah had stepped back toward his car, leaning casually against the driver's door, when Marshall didn't move. Elijah finally spoke. "I take it you figured it out by now." Marshall climbed out of his vehicle, his movement stiff and awkward. The confidence he exuded earlier had drained from his posture. "Governor Porter," he stamed, his tone shifting to something resembling respect. Elijah pushed off the car and approached Marshall, his expression unreadable. "What now, Officer Marshall?" The power dynamics had shifted, but the question remained, what would Elijah do with this moment of revelation? Marshall swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had been caught in his own bias, his own assumption that the man standing before him could be intimidated and belittled. But this was no ordinary citizen. This was the governor, the highest-ranking official in the state, and Marshall had just humiliated himself. Elijah, however, didn't seem angry. He studied Marshall with a calm intensity, as if deciding what to do next. The silence stretched each second more unbearable for the officer. Finally, Elijah spoke. "Let's talk about what just happened," he said, his voice steady but pointed. "I complied with every request you made. My documents are in order. I broke no laws, and yet here we are. Tell me why." Marshall opened his mouth, but found he had no answer, at least not one he could give. He shifted uncomfortably, gripping his belt like it was a lifeline. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, though even he didn't believe it. Elijah's eyebrows lifted slightly, his expression almost pitying. "Your job is that, what you call this?" He gestured toward the open trunk and the contents that had been carelessly tossed aside. "Tell me, Officer Marshall, do you pull over every car like this, or just the ones where the driver looks like me?" Marshall's face reddened, but he couldn't deny the truth. He looked down, avoiding Elijah's gaze. "I didn't know who you were," he admitted quietly. "Exactly," Elijah said, his tone sharpening. "You didn't know who I was, but you assumed I was someone you could treat like this, someone you could dismiss, humiliate, maybe even intimidate. And why? Because of the way I look, the car I drive. Tell me, Officer Marshall, what was it?" Marshall's hands clenched into fists at his sides, not in anger but in shame. He began. But Elijah held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it." Elijah said, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm here to teach you something. Whether you learn it or not is up to you." Marshall's head jerked up, confusion flickering across his face. "Teach me?" Elijah nodded. "You're going to come with me. There's a community forum tonight in a neighborhood not far from here. You're going to sit there and listen to the stories of the people you claim to serve. Maybe then you'll understand the impact of what had just happened here. Maybe then you'll see the bigger picture." Marshall blinked, taken aback. "You want me to go to a forum? I don't want you to," Elijah said. "I'm telling you to, as your governor." His voice left no room for argument. Marshall hesitated, his pride wearing with the undeniable reality of the situation. But deep down he knew he didn't have a choice. "Fine," he said gruffly, though his tone lacked its usual bite. Elijah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes locked on Marshall's. "This isn't about embarrassing you," he said quietly. "It's about making sure you never do this to anyone else. Not because you're afraid of who they might be, but because you've learned to respect everyone equally." Marshall stared at him, the words sinking in. He gave a reluctant nod, though his face betrayed the turmoil brewing inside. "Good," Elijah said, turning toward his car. "Follow me. I'll make sure you're seated front and center." As they drove toward the forum, Marshall couldn't shake the feeling that this night was about to change everything, for better or worse. The two cars pulled into the parking lot of a modest community center in Charlottesville. A small crowd had already gathered, their voices mingling in a hum of anticipation. Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a raised platform where a microphone stood, waiting to amplify voices that had long been ignored. Marshall stepped out of his patrol car, hesitant and unsure. He glanced aimed at Elijah, who stood by his SUV, with the same calm composure he'd shown throughout their earlier encounter. The governor gestured toward the building with a nod signaling for Marshall to follow. The room was packed. Men, women, and teenagers filled the seats, their face a tapestry of emotions: weariness, hope, frustration, and resilience. Some glanced at Marshall as he entered, their expressions guarded. His uniform, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a scarlet letter under their scrutiny. Elijah led him to the front row where a seat had been saved. Marshall sat stiffly, his hands resting on his knees as Elijah approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elijah began, his voice steady and commanding, "thank you for coming tonight. This forum exists because your votes matter. Too often those in power forget that tonight we're here to listen, to learn, and to grow, and that includes me and others who serve our community." His gaze flicked toward Marshall, subtle but pointed. The room buzzed with murmurs, and then the first speaker stepped forward. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a voice that trembled as she began. "My son was pulled over last year," she said. "He was 17, just got his driver's license. The officer said his taillight was out, but we checked it the next day. It wasn't." Her voice broke. "He was so scared he called me from the car, whispering, afraid to even reach for his license." Marshall shifted in his seat, his discomfort palpable. He wanted to look away, but the weight of her words anchored his gaze. Speaker after speaker followed. A young man recounted being frisked while walking home from work because he fit a description. An elderly man spoke of the fear that gripped him whenever his grandchildren left the house. A teenage girl described being asked why she was in a nice neighborhood, as if her presence alone was suspicious. With each story, Marshall felt the walls of his own defenses crumbling. The words hit harder than he'd expected, each one peeling back layers of denial he hadn't realized he carried. Then a young boy, no older than 10, approached the microphone. His small hands gripped the stand as he looked out at the room. "My dad tells me to always be polite to police," he said, his voice high and clear. "But sometimes I think even if I'm polite, they won't like me anyway. Is that true?" The silence that followed was deafening. Marshall's chest tightened as he watched the boy step down, his question hanging in the air like a challenge. No one dared to answer. Elijah returned to the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "This," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "is why we're here, to face the hard truths, to own up to the damage that's been done, and to make sure the next generation doesn't grow up thinking respect is a one-way street." He turned toward Marshall, his expression unreadable. "Officer Marshall, would you like to say something?" Every eye in the room shifted to him. For a moment he couldn't move, then slowly he rose to his feet. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his belt. He cleared his throat, his voice rough but sincere. He hesitated, then forced himself to meet their gazes. "I've spent years thinking I was doing my job the right way, thinking I was enforcing the law. But tonight I realize I've been enforcing my own bias instead. And for that, I'm sorry." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Marshall swallowed hard, continuing, "I don't expect forgiveness and I don't expect trust overnight. But I promise you this, I'm going to do better. I'll start by listening, by learning, and by making sure my actions reflect the respect every one of you deserves." The room was silent for a beat. Then someone began to clap. Slow. Others joined in, the sound growing until it filled the space. Marshall's throat tightened. But this time, it wasn't from shame. It was from something else, something like hope. As the forum ended and the crowd dispersed, Marshall stayed behind, knowing his journey had only just begun. The forum emptied out slowly, but the energy in the room lingered, like the fading notes of a powerful symphony. Marshall stayed seated, staring down at his hands, the weight of the evening pressing on him. Elijah approached, standing silently for a moment. Before speaking, "You did something tonight that many people never get the chance to do." Elijah said, "You admitted you were wrong." "That's the first step, but it's not the last." Marshall looked up, his face a mix of gratitude and weariness. "I don't even know where to begin," he said quietly. "You start by showing up." Elijah replied, "Not just here, but everywhere you're needed. Show up to listen, to learn, to change. That's how you earn trust. Not with words, but with actions." Marshall nodded, the simplicity of the words striking him deeply. "I want to be better," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah studied him for a moment, then offered a faint smile. "Then be better. It's as simple and as hard as that." As they walked out of the building, Marshall felt lighter, though the path ahead still seemed daunting. The governor paused by his SUV, turning to face the officer one last time. "You know," Elijah said, "people like you are the reason I ran for office, not to punish, but to change things I believe people can learn. Even you, Officer Marshall." Marshall chuckled softly, a dry, self-deprecating sound. "I guess I've got a lot of learning to do. We all do." Elijah replied. He opened his car door, but paused before getting in. "This isn't just about you, though. It's about the people you serve. Never forget that." As Elijah docked away, Marshall stood in the parking lot, watching the taillights disappear into the distance. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man enforcing the law. He felt like a man learning to understand it. The next day, Marshall returned to work with a notebook tucked into his pocket. He started asking questions he'd never thought to ask. Before, attending forums he would have ignored, and having conversations he'd once avoided. The stories he'd heard at the community center played on repeat in his mind, a reminder of the lives his actions touched. Months later, Elijah received a letter in the mail. It was from Marshall. Inside was a handwritten note and a photo of a newly established community police relations board. In the note, Marshall wrote, "I still have a lot to learn, but I'm learning. Thank you for giving me the chance to see things differently." Elijah smiled as he read the words. He placed the letter on his desk and leaned back in his chair, thinking of the young boy who had asked the hardest question of the night. Is it true they won't like me anyway? He knew the answer to that question was complicated, but tonight he felt a spark of hope that someday it wouldn't be someday. Respect wouldn't have to be earned through fear or demanded through power. It would be given freely because it was right. The story of Governor Elijah Porter and Officer Ted Marshall is a reminder that change begins with acknowledgement and grows through action. If this story moved, you take a moment to reflect on how you can be part of the solution. Listen, learn, and when the opportunity arises, show up. Subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to build a better world together.